Hello and welcome to everyone to this live interaction on News 9 with me, Ashish Parikh. And again, the topic that we'll be talking about is COVID-19. But this time around, there is something new to this. And, we've been talking about how testing is the key to controlling the pandemic ever since the pandemic began. Of course, everyone's talking about vaccines. But one short way of, making sure that the pandemic does not really go out of control is by increasing the testing, finding out how many people are infected, and then bringing the entire situation into control. This has been the target of governments all across the world, and also at the same time there have been various new methods of testing that have also been experimented during this time, which of course will be useful in the future as well. And while tests like RT-PCR tests are the most common ones that are used as of now, there have been different techniques that have been recommended all over the world. But now the US Food and Drug Administration has given an emergency approval to a special kind of test which is called the saliva-based test. Now this is something that has happened in the US, and naturally Twitter in India and of course social media users in India have picked up on this and have been discussing this extensively, whether it should be brought to India and whether this is something that needs to be incorporated, because of course everyone has this fear of injections and all of these fears when they go in. But during this pandemic there has been a fear among people of there being some sort of discomfort when testing is being done, especially when they're taking the throat swab and the nasal swab. So that has been one of the major concerns of people across the world. And this particular test, which is the saliva based test, is basically a new sort of test that uses saliva samples, and this particular test has been termed as a groundbreaking test by FDA. And this is something that has a lot of people interested around the world, a lot of agencies, a lot of governments interested, and is something that is picking up on. So of course we'll talk about the importance of this and what is its speciality, why is it so groundbreaking, and is it really the right thing to do in India. But before that, let's just talk a bit about this particular test. Now this, just like the RT-PCR test, this also converts the virus RNA into DNA and then amplifies the DNA so that you get the required output. And this basic methodology remains the same even in saliva-based tests. But there is a lot more to this, and there are some sort of special features which has forced the FDA to give out an emergency approval and also term this as something which is groundbreaking. To speak more about this, to shed more light about this particular test that has been picking up pace in India, the discussions have been rife. We have with us our expert for the day, Dr Sitesh Roy, who is from Mumbai and is joining us to explain to us more about this particular test. So first up, Dr. Roy, thank you so much for joining, for giving us your valuable time. And we've been talking about this particular test, and every time you open social media and you start looking up something about diagnostic methods and all of that, this is something that a lot of people are very excited about. So first up, before we get into all of that, what is saliva based diagnostic test and how exactly does it work?
So Ashish, this is a type of test that has been around for a while and has been used for other diagnostics, and especially for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. We know that even 1 ml, 1 milliliter of saliva of an infected individual carries over a billion viral particles, 1 billion. So it has always been an interest for scientists around the world to be able to detect the virus in the saliva without having to put someone through an invasive test like a nasopharyngeal swab, where the stick has to go through the nose almost 4 to 5 inches inside, or a throat swab which can make a person gag.
Yes.
So in that sense, if you just have to spit into a container, and the saliva sample with all the viruses in it can then be transported to a lab, which as early as within 24 to 40 can do the same process that is done through RT-PCR, though this is called real-time RT-PCR. So it's called RT-PCR, by which they do the same process of multiplying the viral RNA into DNA and then getting the specific what we call throughputs or outputs, which tell us that the virus is present in the salivary sample. So this has been a technology that has been really very interesting. Now there are two different types of salivary tests. The first one is the type that I just mentioned. There is a second type that's almost like a urine pregnancy test.
Okay.
So in a urine pregnancy test, where you put a few drops of urine, and if the HCG hormone, which is the hormone that develops in a woman's body when she's pregnant, is present, you see a color change. And so, in a similar way, there is a technology called RT lamp, LAMP.
Okay.
And this RT lamp technology can actually detect the virus in the salivary sample in a much faster way. So, you can actually get results within 45 minutes. And this technology is still not yet approved, but is in the process of being evaluated by the regulation authorities
Yes,
in
yes.
the US FDA. And then we would have more than one technique available to work through saliva.
So, Dr. Rai, the basic idea, the essential, the idea that we're getting out of this is that this is something, that would fasten up the process of testing. This would be something that you would give you results very fast, and this is more of a non-invasive method of diagnostics, which means that even the person who's undergoing the test does not really have any sort of a discomfort. But overall,
Right.
while all of these factors are positives, will it somehow compromise on the accuracy of the test, the efficacy of the test? Because of course other tests, they are obviously you can rely on them for some sort of accuracy is something that is very important at this point in time. So are these tests better than them? Is the saliva based COVID-19 test more accurate, or is it just as accurate as other tests? Because of course it's saving you a lot of time, it's saving you a lot of energy and all of those things, but at the same time, is it just as accurate as other tests?
So on safety, I would also add one thing, Ashish, before I answer the accuracy question, is that even the person who is collecting the sample, they have to be in a full PPE kit
Okay.
when they collect a sample that's a nasopharyngeal swab or a throat swab, because a person may gag and cough or sneeze when the sample is being
Yes.
collected.
So
So
even
even
the
the
risk
risk
to
to
the
the
person
person
taking the sample is reduced in this process, which is a huge advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, it's also very cost effective. So those are additional things to know. Regarding accuracy, some of the tests that have come up, like the one from Yale University that got recent approval, has an accuracy rate of above 90%.
Okay.
But they still give a cautionary word that if you have a high suspicion of someone being infected and still the saliva test comes negative, they do say that go ahead and test it by a second method, maybe an RT-PCR or maybe an antigen test through a nasopharyngeal swab, so that you can be doubly sure that you're not missing even those 10%. And the
Yeah.
nasopharyngeal swab has an accuracy rate of 68 to 70%.
Okay.
So saliva tests are actually better
Mm-hmm.
than the tests that we have been doing so far in some ways.
So that sorry to interrupt. So that brings in another question. Why haven't we had saliva-based tests? If this is much better than the test that we're having at this point in time, why weren't this introduced earlier? Like, is there any drawback as such, or is there any particular reason why this test is now being in the discussion, and while other tests are being carried out? Shouldn't this have been brought in earlier?
The technology behind it is quite tricky,
Okay.
Ashish, and that has been the main reason why it has not been used so far.
Okay.
So you have to have the right container to collect the sample. You have to have the right medium to make sure that till it reaches the lab where the test is done, it can be accurately done, because we don't have any point of care saliva test which is done right where the patient is or where the person is, or like a do-it-yourself at home kit that has yet been approved. These samples still have to be sent into a lab.
Yeah.
And the technology that goes beyond the transportation and also in the processing of the sample and then getting the readout is something that has been worked on. So the earliest time that we as immunologists had been looking at these tests being developed was back in April, and we are in August, and now the approvals are coming through. So
Okay.
it's all related to the technology behind it and having that level of accuracy, as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very easy to miss sometimes through a poorly collected sample, or the quantity of the sample not being enough, or the technology on which it is being run not being completely optimized, and that has all been done now. So that has taken time.
Okay. So, like you said, the technology is tricky. It has a lot of advantages, but the technology was the roadblock so far. And, that obviously stems out another question. Is there any drawback that this particular test has? Is there any, some sort of a side effect or anything that, there is the drawback that this test has that, has prevented this test from coming out in the, in the open apart from the technological blockages like you mentioned?
No. So this is not a test that carries any risk as you can expect because you're spitting into a container, so that cannot have any risk.
Okay.
The only risk with any test is the false positives and the false negatives, okay, because that's where the test fails.
Yeah.
So a false positive is where someone does not have the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 virus in them and the test shows a positivity.
Okay.
That has really not been seen with this test. There is some concern that if there are the old coronaviruses that have caused a cold and an upper respiratory infection, whether that could interfere with the testing, but that seems to be a low concern at this point.
Okay.
And a false negative is where the person is infected, but the test shows that he's not infected or she's not infected. And in that process also, we have found numbers above 90%.
Okay.
So really in terms of risk, no. Certainly someone may think that if this tomorrow becomes a do-it-yourself test and there are a lot of people who are doing it on their own in their own houses, it may create some degree of panic anxiety if there are false positives.
Yes, yes.
But again, I think that that risk is low at this point with the technologies that are being worked on.
Okay. So, of course, like you said, a lot of things are happening revolving around COVID-19. India as well today recorded the highest ever spike in COVID-19 cases, clearly going on to show that with the increase in, the testing, there has also been an increase in the number of cases being reported. Of course, there has been a widespread, outbreak that we can call. Now, so like you said, this test just sounds like the right thing to do at this point in time, saliva-based test without any sort of drawbacks and with accurate result, fast results. So, Dr. Roy, any idea, even if tentatively, when can we expect this test in India, and what are the sort of blockages or regulatory challenges that such approval of such tests take? Because in the US, of course, they've given an emergency approval. In India, how long could it take for us to actually have these kind of tests being conducted?
So there are two factors that go into this. One is the manufacturer of the test should have enough test kits to be able to send it to other countries besides the United States. So, for example, the test that was approved from Yale University, they give the license to the labs that can run the test based on the samples that are sent in by the patients or collected by the doctors.
Okay.
So, before any test in India can come in, the ICMR, our apex body, has to evaluate the data behind the test and also give it an emergency approval, which they did a wonderful job with the RT-PCR, they did a wonderful job with the antigen testing and with the antibody testing. But the first requirement is that the companies, there are several of them in the US that are working on their approvals and have gotten them, one has gotten them, will need to have the setup and the technology to be able to run it in the Indian labs. So I think the first step is the ICMR approval. The second step is the lab affiliation with the main labs in the US that are giving the technology to the other labs in the US also. We'll have to eventually give it to the labs in India. So I think that we are still looking at some time delay before this happens. It's not going to happen in the next day or week.
So, Dr. Roy, on a lighter note, obviously, is there a possibility that before we get this test, there might possibly be a vaccine coming out in the open? Just on a lighter note, I'm asking you that.
I wish you were right, Ashish. I really wish you were right. But the phase 3 trials, which began in June and July, from the 6 companies that are in the front runners for their vaccines, we cannot expect even the data from them to be ready before September. And once the data is ready and it's analyzed, then to see the efficacy, the safety, the immunogenicity, it will take some time. So I know that there are many people in the world who want a vaccine before November 2020, but I really doubt that can happen. It's not that I'm a pessimist, but I am also a science-driven and science-based person. And I just don't see how that could happen unless there are phenomenal results in any of the trials which by which they can get very rapid approval around the globe and start distributing the vaccines. But I think we will get the salivary test before we'll get the vaccine. That's my bet, but it's really up for bets for anyone else also.
So clearly, Dr. Roy, you're being a realist here rather than a pessimist. Of course, I get your point. And yes, saliva-based tests are, the way you've spoken about them, the results that are coming out, the data that is coming out from wherever it's been tried looks very promising, looks something that is the need of the hour, especially given the fact that we have such widespread outbreak. And one of the major challenges that we are facing is, getting the tests on time, and then all of those false positives, false negatives, and various other problems that we are facing. So thank you so much for your time. For speaking and shedding more light about this particular test. So saliva-based tests, like I have been saying, is something that sounds extremely promising, and like Dr. Roy said, it is something that is going to give you more accuracy is also there, and at the same time the test results are also very fast, and at the same time people who are undergoing the test do not really have to undergo any sort of discomfort because it is non-invasive. And also additionally, people who are carrying out those tests, frontline workers, even they are not at as much as risk as they would have been with other tests like the RT-PCR test. So that is all we had to speak about saliva-based tests. Do let us know what you guys think about it. And with that, it's me, Ashish Parekh, wrapping up this live interaction on News 9. Thank you so much for joining. Stay safe, stay happy.